Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network.
Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over.
Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you'd get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. We're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast. I'm Pete Wargent, and today I'm joined by Amy Lunardi, top buyer's agent. Amy, how's things?
Really good. And it was so good to see you and everyone else recently in Sydney, Pete. So I came up and you came down for the roadshow. It was fabulous.
Yes, we do occasionally connect in real life as well as on podcasts. So it was actually a fantastic event. Great turnout, over 200 people, which is good. It wasn't something we've been able to do for 2 or 3 years. So it's great to get back together in person and do some live events. So that was fantastic. Yeah. And how's work going?
Yeah. No, everything is ticking along. I think it's going to be quite busy between now that footy fever has died down and it was all that everyone could talk about in Melbourne for a little while. That's all done and dusted. And
I can vouch for that firsthand because I was one of those people down in Melbourne. Unfortunately, we had a few tears. Kids are big Brisbane Lions fans, and it went right down to the final few minutes of the season, but just couldn't take the flag. But it was actually great to see Melbourne buzzing again. You know, everything packed out and cafes, restaurants, the trams were overflowing. So it's good because, obviously there was a lot of debate about whether the cities would bounce back from COVID. And I personally never doubted it, but it's good to see it actually happening. So,
absolutely.
So Amy, today we're going to talk about building and pest inspection. So anyone who buys a house in Australia, or often a unit or apartment as well, will have a think about building and pest inspections, what they mean, how they should operate, and what they can and can't do for you as part of the purchase process due diligence. So, let's start right from the top, shall we? So a building and pest inspection, Amy, you've done probably hundreds of these over the years, if not thousands.
I would say thousands, yeah. Well, I've been involved in well over 1,000 purchases. And for every property I've actually purchased for clients, on average, we might have missed out on a couple of properties. And I do get a building inspection for 99.5% of properties we pursue. Sometimes the clients will choose not to, and that's their decision as long as they've made an educated decision. But a building and pest inspection is essentially what it sounds like, right? It is someone coming to inspect that property and be able to then give you feedback and give you a report and have a chat to you about any issues that they find with that property. And the purpose of getting a building inspection, it's actually kind of multiple things. So for me, first of all, it's to establish if there's any deal breakers to begin with. Because if there are, you might just decide that's it and you're not going to pursue that property any further at all. It's also to understand any upfront costs that you might need to factor in, especially costs that you need to pay straight away as soon as you move in. So if you're really stretching your budget to, the upper limit, but then you have to pay $5,000 or $10,000 more once you move in straight away for urgent repairs, you might need to factor that into your negotiations or how much you're going to bid to. Sometimes you can negotiate repairs into a contract. Let's talk about that a little bit more later in the episode, actually, Pete. But I think overall, it's just to give you a broad picture of the type of property you're buying, its condition, and can help you actually put a longer term maintenance plan in place to say, okay, well, the roof's in okay condition now, but it might need to be replaced in 10 years. I'm going to put some money aside for that each year. So I'm ready for that when it comes, because I don't know about you, Pete, but I don't get on my roof to check its condition. So by having that report, I can at least put a plan in place for the future.
It's a sad state of affairs, but I actually do have to get on our roof. We have an issue with moss on there sometimes. But anyway, yes, you're right. A lot of people would never get on a roof and sometimes not even practical to do so. So I guess in terms of what a building and pest inspection is going to cover then. So I guess under broad headings, you've got some major defects or deal breakers, which you touched on there. Then maybe some more minor defects, which are things which may need to be looked at in the course of time, but not necessarily deal breakers. Then also potentially some safety hazards, which I think for a landlord buyer is probably front of mind in terms of liability risk. So I guess the kind of things that might be classified as a major defect, I guess roof repairs would be one that you already mentioned there. I guess any structural issues or structurally related issues, and obviously a building and pest inspection, something we know all about in southeast Queensland, termites or white ants as they often call them informally. If there's been live termite activity, that's potentially something that could be very costly. So there are some things which might come under the heading of major defect that might even lead you to pull out from making a purchase if you think it's going to be very costly.
Yeah, absolutely. Major defects mostly are to do with things that affect the structural integrity or may lead to issues which affect the structural integrity. For example, water leaks or moisture or just anything to do with water we want to look at straight away, because left unchecked, water can really lead to major issues going forward. It can lead to movements in the foundation and cracking and just, really impact the structural integrity of that property. So they can often be classed as major defects. But sometimes you might have no major defects, or sometimes you might have a major defect, but it's actually not that bad once you chat to the inspector, and because they have to classify things in certain ways legally. Or other times you might have many, many minor defects, but they all add up. So you might have, tens of thousands worth of minor defects, which also, they're not technically major, but they're major for you because they are quite costly. This is actually a really important thing to be aware of, because depending on where you are and what contract you sign, the standard building inspection contract here in Victoria says that for that building inspection clause that you can only withdraw based on major structural defects. And I try to not use that clause. I actually have my own clause that most of the time I manage to get put in, because again, I want to give myself, first of all, some leeway to withdraw in case there are a bunch of minor ones that add up. And also, just to give myself like a little bit of discretion on my end. That's really important to understand the contract that you're signing and the wording of that clause.
That does make sense, because some people are time poor, and even what might be a minor defect for one person, if there's a whole series of things that need to be fixed, if you haven't got the time or inclination or the funding to do it, that could itself become a deal breaker. And as you mentioned there, sometimes risks have to be classified in a building inspection report. So I think in terms of things like safety hazards, so I think balconies are sometimes things that get flagged as a potential risk area in a building and pest report. And uneven steps, I think for a landlord or a rental type property, you don't want to be hit with a liability claim if somebody trips on some uneven stairs. So you mentioned there potentially, Amy, being able to circle back to the building and pest inspector to actually talk through some of the points that they raise. So it's not just a question of getting a report and reading it. You also ideally want to discuss some of those risks or defects with the person who's actually prepared the report.
This is so important because it puts everything into context. The inspectors have to cover themselves from an insurance and a legal liability point of view by putting so much stuff in there and all of these disclaimers. But once you actually chat to them, they can put everything into perspective. And in some situations, the report or the condition of that property might be nowhere near as dire as that the photos and everything make it seem. So I always use or prefer to use building inspectors who are happy to have a chat with you about the report. In the past, I have, spoken, sometimes clients will have their own preferred inspector and I'll say to them, do you provide a verbal debrief? And they say no. And I find that very unhelpful. So I think before you hire a building inspector, just say, will you have a chat with me after that? But bear in mind that they're not necessarily going to be able to answer questions like, how much is this going to cost to fix? they may be able to give you a ballpark potentially, but you can't necessarily rely on that, especially if you're asking them a question about, how much is it going to cost to replace these gutters? And they're not a plumber or they've never replaced gutters before. So the building inspectors I work with, they can, in some cases, give me very much ballparks. They know that I'm not going to rely on that and hold it to them. But if they can't, they'll say to me, no, I have no idea how much this is going to cost. Go and speak to this kind of person to get an idea of that.
That does make sense. The reason I mentioned balconies, we used to buy about 10 or 12 years ago, quite a lot of Victorian terraces in Sydney and places like Surrey Hills or Paddington, Bondi Junction, and balconies would always be flagged on a building and pest report. If you've had a property that's been there 120 years and it might be there for another 100 years, clearly over a long enough time frame, anything could become a risk, and these things are flagged as a matter of course. I think that's where a verbal explanation can really come into its own. Is this a real risk I need to know about in the immediate future, or is it just something that's being put there as a CYA clause, for want of a better phrase, to cover people's liability risk in the future? Yeah. So you mentioned, Amy, that 99.5% of the time you get a building and pest inspection, but sometimes clients decide not to do them. Are there any types of properties you wouldn't bother with a building and pest report? For example, if it was a property that was going to be, I don't know, demolished and subdivided, or are there times when you wouldn't bother with a building and pest, or would you always go for it?
I mean, if you're going to knock it down, of course, you wouldn't bother doing that. But for me, I would get a building inspection on every single property, regardless of its age, regardless of where it is, the type of property, even brand new properties. And it's very, very rare, but I have sometimes inspected brand new properties and they've had like significant enough defects in them that we've not pursued them. But in most cases for brand new properties, there's just a lot of minor defects. And that's just come down to a slightly lazy or developer that's got to the very end and the trades have just sort of like slapped everything on at the end. And in which case, that's those situations, quite often I can actually negotiate those things to be repaired prior to settlement because it is a brand new property. But yeah, I'll get it on absolutely all types of properties, even ones which you walk through and you're like, this seems so solid, it's double brick, it's just an apartment, shouldn't have any problems. What I find our building inspectors pick up mostly with properties like that is things to do with moisture, things that you can't see unless you're walking around with a moisture meter. I've got one in my handbag actually, but I wouldn't expect you to. But things like the shower leaking, which you cannot see. So that's just something to bear in mind. Even if a property seems like it's in great condition, the building inspector's job is to find things that you can't see.
I think on a long enough timeline, you do probably see everything. I remember once we looked at buying a replica Queenslander modern composite material build in Brisbane, and the building and pest inspector found asbestos in it, and we were like, "But this is a modern, it's a modern property. What the hell's going on?"
How did they get their hands on that?
Well, they'd obviously built around a part of an old dwelling that couldn't be removed or something. So the building, we never would have thought, when we. And of course, the real estate agent feigned ignorance and I'll be damned sort of response. But yeah, I guess you just don't know. Sometimes what's in the structure of a building, as you said, moisture can be a big risk, especially as I mentioned, some of those old Victorian terraces, you will get some moisture, and it's good to know what you're buying, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So the short answer there is get a building inspection regardless. You might not need a pest inspection if you're buying an apartment. If you're especially buying an apartment, it's a brick apartment and it's on the third floor, like you don't need a pest inspection. But if it's on the ground floor and it's got a little courtyard and it's got a deck and, depending on where you are, then you might consider it. So maybe just have a chat to the building and pest inspector and ask their opinion. Most inspectors in Melbourne here that I come across do pest inspections and they're already trained and qualified for that. But just double check when you're hiring someone to see if they can also do that for you as well, or if you need to get a separate person for your pest inspection.
Just as an aside, on a strata title property, Amy, is there some limitation there in terms of what a building inspection report can achieve? If it's just looking at the interior of the one apartment in the block that you're buying, presumably the building inspector is not going to get out there across all the units in the block and get out onto the roof and the common areas. So I guess while you still might use a building inspection, you would still need to do your full due diligence on the whole body corporate, the whole strata scheme, in case there are other risks relating to the building or insurance that you haven't thought about.
Yeah, absolutely. So your inspector will just be looking at your particular dwelling or your particular unit. They won't be commenting on the common property or anywhere else. I mean, I've had inspectors sometimes say to me, "Hey, Amy, I noticed a really large crack, on the outside of the building. Maybe just double check that with the OC." So, but that's not what they are engaged to do. So all the more reason why it's up to you to have really thorough discussions with the body corporate manager if you can do that. Not all body corporate managers will speak to you. I believe in New South Wales, it's not really a common thing, but we certainly do that. And then also getting, the history, doing a strata report, getting previous minutes, which should capture anything in there which could determine more major issues with common property, which have happened historically or which may be a consideration in the future. I've just was helping a client recently where the body corporate were already discussing a full replacement of all of the sewerage lines, reconcreting the driveways. It was going to be quite a significant cost, but we managed to uncover that through chatting to the body corporate manager and going back through the historical minutes of that block.
Indeed. And we've even seen previously a building inspection just in a single apartment, but still finding things like asbestos in cupboards or things that you wouldn't have expected to be there given the age of the block. So definitely worth considering in all circumstances. So in terms of the actual purchase process, Amy, you're wanting to do this or to get engaged with a building inspector at the outset of the process, I guess, so well in advance of actually getting to the point of signing a contract and pulling the trigger.
Yeah, so if you find a property and you like it and you say, this is one I want to pursue, I would always start off by doing the things that don't cost you any money. So that is figuring out how much that property is worth, doing your comparable sales analysis to make sure that you can actually afford it or that you have a chance of being able to afford it, maybe getting your contract reviewed. Sometimes legal reps will charge for that, sometimes they don't. Doing your council checks, strata checks, all of those free things that you can kind of do on the couch. And then getting your building inspection done, because that is a sunk cost if you are unsuccessful with that property. And then you can make a decision on when you want to do that. For example, if the property is going to auction in 4 weeks and the agent has said it's 1,000% going to auction, you might decide to do that inspection closer to the auction if you've got a few other contenders. Or you might say, no, get this over and done with so that I can rule it out if there's problems, or that I can follow up extra inspections or quotes, etc., if I need to give yourself time. But for an auction, you will need to get your building inspection done beforehand because not everyone knows this, but auctions are unconditional. You can't get a building inspection later. But if you want to buy a property via private sale, you're going to have to make a decision on whether you'll get your building inspection up front or you make your offer subject to a building inspection. This is going to be a little bit state specific or state dependent because I believe in some other states it's pretty common to just have your offer subject to this. Is that what would be the norm, I guess, Pete, or is there a norm in Queensland?
More common in Brisbane or Queensland to make an offer subject to finance and subject to building and pest inspection. I would think in a very competitive Sydney market, you might be wishful thinking that a vendor is going to agree to that, though. So it really depends on, where you're buying in the country and what the normal course of action is. Also, the market cycle plays a difference. If the market's red hot, then the vendors may not want to hang around waiting for you to have a building and pest inspector go through with a fine-tooth comb, and there might be countenancing multiple offers. But yeah, in the normal course of affairs in Brisbane, you'd make the offer subject to building and pest, and then you'd have maybe 10 business days to go through that process. Not necessarily the case everywhere, though.
No, well, certainly in Melbourne, there's pros and cons of doing one prior or making your offer subject to with a private sale. The benefit of getting one up front is so that, first of all, you know what you're dealing with and you can factor in any repairs or costs into your negotiations and how much you're willing to spend, because it can be more challenging once you've purchased a property subject to a building inspection to then renegotiate later. Not impossible, but more challenging. And then by getting it done up front as well, you are also just reducing the amount of conditions in your contract. You are making your offer more appealing. You can then sometimes have more negotiating power. And especially if you're in a situation with competition, the fewer clauses you have in your contract, the better, the more competitive you are. But the downside is if you miss out, you've wasted, say, $600, and it's really, really annoying. So you just need to have a lot of thorough conversations with the agent and weigh all of that up. Quite often, if a property is off market and I know there's no urgency and I know that maybe the vendor's a bit high on price or for whatever reason, I make it subject to a building inspection until I get to the point where I feel like maybe it's worthwhile getting it up front. But if I've got no competition and if I'm confident that there's no risk of doing it afterwards, I'll do that as well.
That makes sense. Now, you mentioned the importance, Amy, of verbal communication with the building inspector. So I've got a tripartite question for you here.
Tripartite? I haven't heard
that word. Or is it a triumvirate of questions? Anyway, there's three of them.
I don't even know what those words mean.
A trio is probably a better word. So here they are. So firstly, what sort of questions would you ask the building inspector before you engage them? Secondly, do you actually go along to the building and pest inspector and sit on their shoulder chirping questions, or do you just let them get on with it? And then thirdly, once the building and pest report is done, what are the questions you should be asking the building inspector about the report? So if that's not too long a question or series of questions. Yeah. So firstly, what do you ask them before you engage?
So I would ask them if they do that verbal debrief afterwards. I'd also have a chat to them about their turnaround. So ideally, especially if you're in a time pressure situation, you want to get the report and feedback within 24 hours. And then I'd also just ask them a little bit about their background, because a building inspector doesn't necessarily have experience building properties. They don't necessarily have any kind of trade experience like being a carpenter or a plumber or anything. They might not even have, hammered a nail into the wall before, but they've done their building inspection license. So it's not vital for them to have any kind of practical experience. There's certainly plenty of building inspectors out there who I'm sure are very, very good at their job. But the ones that I use, one of them has a building background. He was a registered builder before and built properties, and the other one's a carpenter. So they just have that bit of extra experience, which I think really, really helps when they're giving advice and also giving recommendations as well. So that's just an extra question to ask so that you understand what their qualifications or background is. But then the second part of your question is, no, I would not suggest generally attending with the building inspector, only because you do want them to focus on what they're doing. But if you want to go and if you've preempted that with the agent and with the building inspector, then that is okay as well. It's not like a hard no.
On occasion where somebody wants to make an unconditional offer and they want to do it quickly, they think, well, if I could go around with the building inspector and if he can show me any defects in real time and we can make a judgment call on them, when time is really of the essence, that it might be of benefit to be there just to get the job done as quickly as possible without having to wait for the full written report. So it's not the norm, but yes, I have seen it on occasion.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what I tend to do with my building inspectors is once they've gone through the property, I'll have a quick high-level debrief with them. And that's just to really understand any kind of major things I need to be aware of really quickly. But generally what will happen is ideally you should get the building inspection report back first so you've got context when speaking to them. Otherwise, if time is of the essence, maybe have that initial chat first, then read the report, and then clarify any further questions. So really what you're trying to achieve out of that is understanding what the biggest ticket items are, which you need to be aware of, which may need to be fixed or, whether it's now or in the future. And if you can get a ballpark price, that's great. And if you can't, maybe saying to the inspector, who would you recommend that I speak to get a more accurate price of this if that's something that you need to factor in. And then just understanding what maybe the longer term things are. So breaking down, when would I need to do this? How urgent things are. Because, the idea of maybe getting a new roof, which is say, 15 grand, whatever it could be, if that needs to be done tomorrow, that's going to impact your decision more than if the inspector says, well, this needs to be done in the next 7 to 8 years. So the timeframes are really, really important here.
You did actually mention there, Amy, a level of experience or background. So presumably a building inspector that you would look for, you wouldn't be looking for the cheapest or the least cost. You'd be looking for somebody with the appropriate level of experience, ideally with a recommendation from somebody. I guess you have your favorites that you use already. But if you're a buyer and you didn't know about where to find a building inspector, what should you do? Look for a recommendation, jump on Google? How would you go about it?
Yeah, I guess it's one of those things like with anything when you're trying to find property professionals, recommendations are great. Google reviews are great. There's only a certain, I guess, extent that you can go because your friend might have got a building inspection done, but it's hard because maybe they've only been in that property for 6 months and the building inspectors missed something and they won't know about it for a couple of years. So, they're really only commenting on their experience in that particular report and how that person dealt with them. Whereas I think Google reviews are good because maybe they just cover a longer time span. But yeah, that's what I would sort of start off by doing is referrals. Where it can be a little bit more, this is sort of like a bit of a hard one is where the agent recommends a building inspector. Not to suggest all agents will do this, but I do know of some agents who have in the past referred certain inspectors who they know are a bit more lenient. And that's not ideal.
That's the real estate industry. Well, you've almost preempted, Amy, my next question, which is what happens in this scenario? You turn up to an open home. Let's say there's a property going to auction and you say, are there any issues with the property? And the real estate agent says, don't worry about that. We've had a building and pest inspection report done. You can buy it for, let's say, $200, cheaper than you would normally pay. And there's no issues. So don't worry about it. Would you place reliance on that report that are being prepared by a building inspector for the vendor and for the real estate agent, or would you just get your own done anyway?
Well, at the end of the day, a building inspector does have liability, right? They are still out there needing to maintain a level of standard and they have insurance in place for if things go wrong and, you could go down the civil the action if there is a problem and you need to pursue them like legally. But you don't want to have to do that. You don't want to have to go down that path. But I know a couple of building inspectors who do those reports where they've done it for the vendor and they on-sell them. And I know those inspectors. I've used them before and I'm happy with those. So it's not always a case of saying, danger, danger, don't buy those reports. I wish there was a more black and white answer here. But I would say if you have your own person who maybe your friends have used or they really come really highly reviewed, maybe just use them instead if time and budget permits.
That was really the reason I was keen to explore the question because I don't think it's a yes or no answer. I've used them in the past. Sometimes if a property looks like it might have issues, you might just want for peace of mind to get somebody else to go through and give you a full inspection opinion that is third party. So, case by case basis, I guess.
Whatever you do, maybe don't get your building inspector off TikTok because I know some that are on there that I know in real life that are not so good.
I don't even have a TikTok account.
I'm not even going to elaborate on that further, but if you're on TikTok, you might know what I mean.
Yeah, I'm not. I know you're a keen advocate of the platform, Amy, but...
I don't post there. I just watch.
Yeah, so I'm too old for all of that stuff myself. So, all right, we're getting towards the crunch point of the conversation. So there's a couple of other things. So yes, you mentioned repairs costs or repairs coming up or defects that might need fixing. And you might want to factor this into your negotiation, but you don't really know how much a repair is going to cost. And as you said, a building inspector may not provide a quote or a range. So what do you do there? Do you get somebody else to quote you?
Yeah, sometimes. And this can be tricky because in property, sometimes you need to do things really quickly. And if you want to get a plumber out to quote, or an electrician or whoever, they might not be free for a week or 2 or 3, especially if it's just a quote and they're prioritizing other jobs. So this can be hard. Sometimes you can provide photos, or you might have a friend of a friend who's a plumber that can give you a ballpark. But just be aware that if you are speaking to the inspector, they're not always going to be able to say, okay, to repair that leaking shower is going to be $5,400. You know, they can't necessarily give you that information.
It's a good point, actually. And I guess there's a couple of things there. One is the potential limitations on a building inspection, because it's not going to be able to cover everything. And I guess running off that, are there other inspections that you may need? For example, plumbing or electrical, or something that's not necessarily covered by the building and pest inspection?
Yeah, so the building inspection, they will have quite a few limitations, and because they generally don't extend to checking the plumbing and checking the electricals. So they're not going to put a pipe through all of the plumbing and see the condition of all of the pipes. And especially with much older properties, this can be more relevant. If they do see anything which could signify further issues, maybe they'll suggest that you consider further inspections. But we have in the past then got plumbers out to put cameras down pipes. We have had structural engineers come out to properties because the building inspector says, look, this could be an issue. It may or may not be. It's beyond the scope of my experience. And then I've got a structural engineer out. That sounds very expensive, but the ones I've found sort of charge around that $700 or $800 mark. That's been invaluable, because I've had a few done where they say, look, this looks worse than it is. It's actually fine. And then I've also got a moisture expert on tap, I'll call him. I call him up whenever I've got something which is a problem with moisture that I need further advice on. So these are people that I've got, on speed dial, I guess. But you might not necessarily have that. So all the more reason why maybe give yourself a little bit of extra time, especially if it's an older property or a property which you can see probably could have issues, to then get further inspections if you choose to do so.
That makes a lot of sense. So just to pull that together then, Amy, so essentially, if you're buying a property in Australia, we'd recommend that you get a building and pest inspection done. And what that's going to cover is, I guess, well, 3 things really. It's this major defects, potential deal breakers, or something that could be very expensive, but also potentially some minor defects as well, things that you might need to fix either now or in the future. And then any potential safety hazards, which I think if you're buying a rental property or an investment property, that could prove to be important. And then I guess to engage early with the building and pest inspector and be able to discuss with them verbally any issues that are arising.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I'll just also finish by saying a further limitation of building inspections is that they cannot necessarily comment on absolutely everything. There might be lots of furniture in that property. There might be lots of rubbish and stuff underneath the property. There might not be a manhole to climb into the roof. If it's double story, they might not be able to get onto the roof. They might not be able to get into the subfloor. So a building inspector will comment on as much as they can. But like with a lot of things with buying property, there will still be residual risks, especially if they've had a lot of limitations throughout that inspection. So that really, all the more reason why you have to have those thorough conversations with them about, okay, what couldn't you see and what could the risks there be, so that you can make an educated decision on whether you're willing to take on those risks. There's no such thing as being completely risk-free with a lot of property decisions, but when it comes to building inspections, absolutely you need to keep that in mind.
That's perfectly summarised. Thanks, Amy. So last time I saw you, you were hanging out at the trendy end of Surrey Hills in Sydney. What have you got on at the weekend? Any big auctions or big open homes to get to?
I've got, this weekend I've got 3 auctions on for the same client.
Wow.
So that's going to be a big weekend. She's not even going to come along. She just said, text me a thumbs up or a thumbs down as to how we go. But yeah, that's my weekend. And one on a Sunday as well, because it's in a part of Melbourne where they only do auctions on Sundays. So I've got a 7-day week this week, Pete. Good
Certainly
fun.
earn your crust as a buyer's agent. Yes, the stress involved in going to multiple auctions in one weekend That's a lot of value add there that you're providing for your clients. So thanks, Amy. That's brilliant. And if people want to catch you for some more info, where should they go for more?
Oh, so to find me, amylunardi.com.au. That's my buyer's agency business. We've also got a first home buyer online course specifically for Victorians, which is the firsthomeguidebook.com.au. And how about you, Pete? Where can we find you?
Usually on Twitter at Pete Wargent or my
Not
daily
TikTok.
blog. Certainly not TikTok. I think I'm on Instagram though. But yeah, Pete Wargent Blogspot's my daily blog. And if you've got any questions at all that you'd like us to cover in the Australian Property Podcast, do shoot us a line. We've got a link in the show notes below. And yeah, we'd definitely like to try and cover whatever's hot and whatever you want us to talk about. So thanks for joining. And thanks so much, Amy. I'll look forward to chatting again soon.
See you, Pete. Bye.
Cheers.